Well, I have Professor Bridget Anderson from Oxford University. She's a professor of migration and citizenship, and it's a very significant coupling, because often those who do study migration only tangentially get interested in issues of citizenship, and vice versa, although the two are quite internally linked. But one of the things about Bridget's work is that it's not just that she does both, but she does the relationship between the two. Often she raises issues about, for example, in her book Us and Them, how the distinction between citizens, well-regarded citizens of liberal democracies, are juxtaposed against various other figures that are constituted as them, that introducing that distinction between us and them. And she studied various figures like refugees, the question of the figure of the migrant in relation to that question of citizenship. She's also edited a book with a colleague on citizenship and its others, or is it citizens and its others?
Citizenship.
Citizenship and its others, which captures really the ways in which Bridget comes to these issues. But Bridget is also quite well embedded and active in various migration-related, citizenship-related issues, and regularly she finds time and the energy to participate in various migrants' struggles. She and I did a project together on politics and ethics of the refugee crisis, where that was the first time we really closely worked together, and I really appreciated working together with Bridget because precisely of her both political and ethical sensibilities about how we get to use various languages in describing something as a problem. And so I'm really very pleased to introduce her. Without further ado, she is going to speak about 45 minutes, and we're going to have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. Bridget.
Thanks, Engin. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'll just get some water. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to Paris in the spring. Yeah, I think we had a really interesting working relationship and project together, which in a way I think some of what I'm going to talk about today builds on the work that we've done. So I want to think about Brexit and Trump, and where that leaves those of us who critique, or even who just want to temper the dominant hostile narrative on migration. And I suppose by us I mean both the concerned general public, but also particularly academics and scholars who analyse and research immigration. Because if we when we critique, basically our position is often taken to just show how far removed we are from the experiences of ordinary people, as if there's no value to scholarship. But on the other hand, how can we avoid either being in the role of the kind of Enlightenment professor who goes and shares their knowledge with the masses, or some kind of colonial missionary who's going to convert people to the correct liberal line on immigration? And I think this goes to the heart of critically, politically engaged scholarship, and the fraught relationship between the academic and the political that becomes exposed through the critical study of the social. And it's also, in the contemporary moment, about what tools we all have as academics, politicians, activists, community workers, in engaging with issues of urgency, something which is an issue of urgency in the lives of millions of people, which is about migration. But like I think many academics who study this, most people, I think, when you're an academic and you're studying something that is, your area of expertise and specialism, when you hear about it on the news, you feel really excited and pleased. But of course, every time, if you're studying migration, every time you hear about it on the news, your heart sinks. Like, why are they talking about this again? Writing with respect to the UK press coverage of immigration, the BBC Home Affairs editor Mark Easton says, and I quote, "Conjurers call it misdirection, encouraging an audience to look over there when the sleight of hand is taking place over here." And he's speaking specifically about immigration in this case. What I want to suggest is that paradoxically, while migration has become so central to political debate, maybe really we should be thinking more about citizenship. So I want to just begin to explore this thought and how thinking with it might help us have a more productive debate about migration, which is about making new connections between people rather than reinforcing differences. So I'm going to talk first about Brexit and EU citizenship, and then consider the consequences of immigration controls for citizens, and argue that this exemplifies a relationality between migration and citizenship, and actually the consequent instability of citizenship. We don't know who a migrant is, but that also means we don't know who a citizen is either. And I will then show how migration establishes new lines of difference between citizens, and not just between citizens and migrants, and argue that perhaps we should make visible the hidden role of assumptions about the worker citizen, and through doing this that we could maybe move towards a less exclusionary politics. So to start off thinking about Brexit, I'm not going to go on very much about that. I'm not an expert on Brexit, but I have been exposed to the media debates, the pub conversations, and I think in the same way as Trump's victory is represented as the voice of a segment of US society that has suffered from global free trade, so the Brexit result has been analysed as a vote by the left behind, which is explained by poverty, low skills and lack of opportunities. In his post-victory speech, UK independence leader Nigel Farage, who actually I really like to call Nigel Farage, just to annoy him, dubbed the Brexit vote, and I quote, when he came out, he gave a speech on the Green outside Parliament, and he said, "This was a victory for the real people." So who are the real people? Well, they're set in contrast with the metropolitan elite, which is a very heterogeneous bunch of presumably not real people, including some, but not everybody, who's wealthy, so it includes bankers, but not millionaire businessmen, members of parliament, journalists, academics, obviously, and other middle-class urbanites. There's a distinctly anti-intellectual tone to the public debate, and the kind of Leave vote has been characterised as a kind of vote of emotion over reason, a vote of feeling over fact, and I do think we have to be careful with this because it's rather oversimplistic. I don't think we should set up emotion as being the opposite of rationality. People are angry for a reason, and social scientists should be sympathetic to calls to value experience, if not to the concomitant claim to authenticity. I suspect too that the content of emotion in this case is largely supplied by nationalism, and we would do well to think about the power of the affective pull of the nation. So these representations, which is a basically disenfranchised white working class people voting for Brexit against their own best interests, I think should be taken with a pinch of salt, in that plenty of middle class people voted Leave. There were people who voted Leave as a protest against neoliberalism, austerity, elite-based politics and London. And there were people who voted for Remain for financial interests. And this isn't a scientific claim, this is just based on people that I know. So I'm not really thinking about the reasons behind the Brexit vote, but rather the story as it's represented. And in this story, there's two elements that I want to focus on. The first is that EU nationals are viewed by the British public as being EU migrants. And this is a position that's adopted by the government. So when people talk about EU nationals in Britain, they use the term EU migrants. The European Commission much prefers the term mobile citizen. So I think one thing about the EU migrants is, of course, there's no citizenship. It doesn't appear in that designation. You can take it or leave it. Whether or not they're a citizen doesn't matter. The fact is that they are a migrant. In 2013, when Austria, Britain, Germany and Netherlands wrote a joint letter to the Irish presidency and the Commission to complain that, and I quote, certain immigrants from other member states avail themselves of the opportunities that freedom of movement provides, without, however, fulfilling the requirements for exercising this right, the then Home Affairs Commissioner, Cecilia Malmström's response strongly objected to their use of the word immigrant. And she was supported by Viviane Reding, then Commissioner for Justice, Fundamental Rights and Citizenship, who said, and I quote, "Let language not betray us. European citizens exercising their right to free movement are not immigrants." So that's one thing that is clear in Brexit and the conversation, is that, unlike the Commission, in British public debate, EU citizens are called migrants. The second point in this representation that I want to emphasise is that hostility to migration and to migrants was an important factor in the Brexit vote. The migrant, I think, exemplifies the fluidity of relations between a nation, a people, the real people, and state. And whilst there's been considerable academic critique of the utility of concepts like the state and the market, which comprise the traditional tools of liberal politics and sociology, and there's also been significant changes in ways of thinking about power, this has not filtered through into contemporary public discourse. And the state, the government, continue to be the frame through which public discourse understands the distribution and accountability of political and economic power. And it's a frame that's proving increasingly shaky, as not just immigration, but technology, global capital and finance and so on are proving highly resistant to state regulation. This is exacerbated by a crisis in representation, as political elites are felt to be ever more removed from the lives of these real people. So these crises of nation state and representation are intertwined, and I think for some the European Union became emblematic of both. So promises of strong control over immigration appeal to the hope of a national labour market and national economy, a stable and cohesive national society, and representative democratic politics. Hostility to migration shouldn't be analysed simply as a policy failure that permitted too many migrants to enter, but the consequence of multiple policies that disenfranchised and impoverished millions of people on the one hand, and the years of setting up so-called migrants as the reason for lack of jobs, low wages and poor public services. It wasn't a migration policy failure that lay behind Brexit, but the long-term political success of scapegoating migrants. So that's the story of British people tired of migration and allegedly why we voted Leave. So what we see clearly laid out here, bringing these two questions, these 2 points together, is that who counts, the question of who counts as a migrant and relatedly who counts as a citizen is of political importance. If migrants are a problem that people, and I don't think this is just about Britain, I think this is generally how immigration controls are represented, is basically they are necessary to protect the people, whether that's from the point of view of national security or labour markets or culture or whatever, that they protect citizens. So if there's a problem here that people need to be protected from, who is it? Who are these people that we need to be protected from? So this goes to the question of who counts as a migrant, which obviously depends on who is doing the counting. So there's lots of different ways that you can define migrant, and when we look sort of internationally, the data sets tend to use the UN definition of long-term international migrants, LTIM, which is defined as a person who moves to a country other than that of his or her usual residence for a period of at least a year, so the country of destination effectively becomes his or her new country of usual residence. So that's the UN definition, and that when you see kind of global figures on migration and mobility and how they're measured. That's the definition that is being used. So, of course, what's interesting about that, a person who moves to a country other than that of his or her usual residence, is, of course, there's nothing there about citizenship. So, for the purposes of an ELTIN definition, if you're a British person who's been living outside the UK, you've been teaching in Japan for 4 years and you're coming back to the UK, you count as a migrant. Even though you're a British citizen, you will, under that definition, count as a migrant. For the purposes, so that's the international definition. For the purposes of national data, law and policy, the migrant can also be defined as foreign born or foreign national, or the person subject to immigration control. And none of these definitions are equivalent. You can be foreign born, but you can also be a citizen. And not all foreign nationals are subject to immigration controls. And actually, although this seems a bit arcane, the definition does have a significant impact on the data. So, for example, in the UK, in 2015, 16.7% of all those employed were foreign born, but 10.7% were foreign nationals. So if you're worried about migrant share in the labour market, depending on your definition, it can appear 60% larger or smaller. So, no, not 60% smaller, sorry. But anyway, you get the picture. So, unusually in the UK, actually, and another problem for the government policy is that ELTIN data, the UN definition, figures in national policy because that's the definition that the net migration target uses. And what that means is that a British couple who are going to retire in Spain, for example, count as outgoing migrants. And as I say, the Japanese British, the person coming in, counts as an incoming migrant. But all of these are mere details. These are all in the domain of the maligned expert, and public discourse and debate is rarely engaged with the niceties of definition. And this is a problem because, of course, the definition is critical to the numbers that then figure on the front pages of national newspapers. So I was actually speaking at Wallingford, which is a small market town in England, last week. And people were really surprised to realise that because they were foreign born, that they were migrants, and that actually the headlines were talking about them. They were quite shocked, that they would kind of get wrapped up in this. So I think thinking about who counts as a migrant in public debate and in political debate is another layer on top of this. So Prince Philip was born in Greece. He's foreign born, but do people say he's a migrant? No, he doesn't. He's not imagined as a migrant. Neither are US financiers working in London. British people, they're not migrants. They're definitely expats. So migrant is a term that's used of those whose mobility or whose presence is regarded as inherently problematic. So what's invoked when we use the term migrant is not really a legal figure nor a data set, but actually a very politicised figure. So in fact, many EU citizens don't think of themselves, who are residing in the UK, also don't think of themselves as migrants. And at the moment we're seeing a lot of really terrible stories about the situation of EU nationals, about people, adults who were born in London, who've lived all their lives, they're being told they've got no right to remain, people being served with notices telling them they have to leave because they've ticked the wrong box. There's also an issue with these health insurance. I don't know if anyone's been following that if you were a student, if you're an EU national student, you were supposed to have health insurance, private health insurance, even though you're eligible to use the NHS, because you're not you're not supposed to be have recourse to public funds under another rule. So what we're finding now, particularly EU academics, EU national academics, who are now concerned and applying for permanent residence, are finding that they're not eligible for permanent residence because when they were a student, they hadn't paid private health insurance. So those whatever, 3 to 5 years don't count as being legal residents. So that's actually a real problem for some people. So these very kind of small bureaucratic issues actually now are becoming to really matter. And it's absolutely shameful. People have every right to expect to be able to stay. But I also feel like this is what hundreds of thousands of people have already experienced. This is what the UK Home Office does. This is the situation of endured by many migrants from outside the European Union for decades. This is the logic of immigration control. So I think there's a danger that's in the ways that this is being covered at the moment and the impact on EU citizens, which is that there's an injustice because it's being applied to the wrong people. It's kind of not that there's a systemic or structural problem, but actually this is, it's okay for them, but it's not actually okay for us because we're EU citizens. And this risks, I think, making a dividing line out of what should be a connection. And there's a kind of weird converse as well, which is that many British citizens are also labelled second generation or third generation migrants, even though they've never crossed a border in their lives. And of course, this is a very racialised term at the moment. So, kind of who counts as a migrant and who counts as a citizen in sort of public conversations, I think, is a very charged question and is framed by assumptions about race, gender, class, and nationality. And racism, I think, is deeply imbricated in migration practices. In the US, Jacqueline Stevens found that approximately 20,000 US citizens were detained or deported as aliens from the US between 2003 and 2010. So she did this she's a legal scholar, and her research uncovered, and I'm quoting, US citizens who'd previously been housed and self-sufficient or cared for by their families, bathing in the Tijuana River and eating garbage, drifting among Latin American shelters. In other states, a US citizen may remain in the US illicitly or in legal limbo, awaiting deportation to a country that will not issue travel papers. And she notes that as a group, the characteristics of illegally deported US citizens mirror the characteristics of people who are vulnerable to signing forced confessions. So basically what happens is you have people who are vulnerable, who have maybe mental health issues, who don't know how to read and write, who have very limited education, who are put into immigration detention, and because there's so few legal safeguards, they end up signing a piece of paper because it's going to get them out of detention. So there have been similar cases reported in the UK, though as far as I know there's been no systematic research on this. So I think we have to recognise the racialisation of migrant, but also that whiteness is also not stable or homogeneous. So EU nationals largely are considered white, but a certain kind of, not quite as white as the whiteness of British people. And they are classed as white, but they can still be undesirable migrants and subjected to discriminatory labour conditions and racialised violence. And we saw a particularly pernicious feature of the Brexit debate was the claim that leaving the EU would mean, and I quote, more black people will qualify to come in. Writing in the Daily Telegraph, Farage explained, UKIP wants to ensure that highly skilled people from the Commonwealth, from India, Canada, New Zealand and beyond, and I was thinking, where's beyond New Zealand? Get a fair chance to get into Britain, unlike now where we give precedence via our open border with the European Union to 500 million people from Europe and its former communist countries. So we have an effective appeal to empire over Europe and communism, and via highly skilled and the inclusion of India, class over race. And I think it builds on a long-standing argument. It's not racist to be concerned about immigration because migrants, that term, are from Eastern Europe, migrants are white, black British people don't like Eastern Europeans, black people can't be racist, and Eastern Europeans are racist. So now, while it's supposed to be that we can have a race-free debate about immigration, in practice the debate is actually quite overtly about race, and it's whiteness of migrants or the working class that is being foregrounded here. The fact is that race, while always reducible to skin pigmentation, is far more complex and is also bound up with ideas of culture and civilizational discourses and ideas of backwardness, and we shouldn't underestimate the multiple and contradictory dynamics that come into play when we're talking about immigration. So the instability of who counts as a migrant means that who counts as a citizen is also unstable. One of the characteristics of citizenship is supposed to be that you're not affected by immigration controls, that you're allowed to enter your country of citizenship freely. But in practice, immigration controls are encroaching deeply into citizens' lives. Immigration is policed not only by immigration officers, but by lorry drivers, employers, registrars, university lecturers and others. Ordinary citizens, the real people again, are encouraged to report people that they suspect of breaching immigration laws. And ordinary citizens can also be criminalised by controls. We can see this across Europe. Citizens harbouring, facilitating illegal entry, or deliberately employing a so-called illegal immigrant may be subject to criminal prosecution. Danish campaigner Lisbeth Zornig gave a lift to a family of Syrians and was fined 22,500 kroner, one of 279 people charged under people trafficking laws in Denmark in the period September 2015 to February 2016. Greek police pressed charges carrying prison sentences of up to 10 years in jail against a group of Spanish lifeguards guilty of rescuing refugees in Lesbos. While in France, a former British soldier stood trial for attempting to bring a 4-year-old Afghan girl from the Calais refugee camp to reunite with her family in the UK. So immigration controls don't just criminalise migrants, they also potentially criminalise citizens. But these kinds of intrusions are particularly marked when people are poor. So immigration controls and enforcement are often presented as principally for the protection of the low-waged or the unemployed, but actually these groups are also particularly liable to be negatively affected by them. For example, in the UK, we've just had rolled out a system that requires landlords to check that tenants have the so-called right to rent. This is a very curious right that didn't exist until people were told that they didn't have it. And it's also a curious right given that rents are absolutely extortionate, that there's very poor, very limited social housing available. In fact, we're facing a serious housing crisis, and yet we do all have the right to rent unless we're a certain type of migrant. So this scheme, which is now being rolled out nationally, was piloted a couple of years ago, and research on its impacts was conducted by the Joint Council of the Welfare of Immigrants and published a few weeks ago, found predictably that it led to discrimination. Because of course, people who don't have passports are likely to be hard up. What they found was that minority ethnic British tenants with no passports were 26% less likely to be offered a room, but also white British tenants with no passport, 11% less likely to be offered a room. So this kind of consequence, negative consequence for the low-waged or unemployed is not peculiar to the UK. I think we see this across EU member states. The requirement for a citizen to have a minimum income before they can be joined by a partner or a spouse is an example of how immigration and naturalisation laws can turn our attention well away from the gendered and classed and racialised boundaries within formal citizenship, depicting all citizens as somehow formally and equally included, even as actually immigration helps to create differentiated citizenship by bearing down disproportionately on certain groups of citizens. And differentiated citizenship isn't only a question of laws, but also policy and practice. And the negativity of the term migrant can also be harnessed to the detriment of marginalised citizens in these domains too. For example, the UK's 2011 Localism Act has meant that English local authorities now have competence, a very scarce resource. So in the past few years, they've all produced social housing allocation policies, which are really fascinating reading, believe it or not. And they denounce migrants. You see migration coming up a lot in these housing policies. Criminals, drug addicts, just coming for benefits, so on and so forth. However, and they use the word migrants. However, as Tendring District Council put it in their policy, quote, by migration, we are not just talking about people moving to and from the UK, it also means the movement of people to and from different parts of the country. So we can see British citizens who are on welfare benefits or who are low wage are also being termed migrants under certain conditions. And interestingly, the local government responses to these migrants when it comes to social housing often bear striking similarities to naturalisation requirements. So basically they have two types of responses to stop people from claiming social housing. One is a residence requirement, so in some places you have to be resident for 10 years before you can even get on the waiting list. But the other is behavioural requirements. So it varies from local authority to local authority, but things like literally going to the gym, doing voluntary work if you're unemployed, losing weight. These kinds of very specific requirements are being made of people so that they can show that they are the right kind of person who should be allowed on the social housing list, which to me kind of bears a real resemblance with naturalisation. So I think of it as the way that actually British citizens, certain types of British citizens, are also now being turned into migrants. These differentiations were given a particular flavour through EU citizenship. As we all know, free movement of EU citizens is one of the 4 fundamental freedoms. And in EU member states, in a move that I think is actually highly reminiscent of the old poor laws and parish relief, because people are no longer subject to immigration controls, actually that's been replaced by access to the welfare state. So now there's no levers to control mobility of people. It can't be done through the levers of immigration control. It's actually access to the welfare state that is being used to prevent or limit people's mobility, and that's quite kind of overt. Under the Free Movement Directive, of course, EU citizens have the right of free movement with no conditions on their stay for the first 3 months. And after this period, an extended right to residence is contingent on self-sufficiency, being a student or being a worker. So residence for the economically inactive is contingent on not becoming a so-called undue burden on the social assistance of the country of residence. So the right to residence of an EU citizen in another member state requires either that you're self-sufficient or you're economically active. You can, if you become unemployed, retain the status of a worker, but that's often very temporally limited, and so you can have you can remain with the status of a job seeker, but then that can only last for a certain period of months. But these restrictions on access for EU citizens, we can see clearly in the UK case, affect British nationals too. Under current arrangements, UK nationals returning from a period abroad can find themselves classed as benefit tourists if they apply for certain means-tested social security benefits or social housing. The habitual residence test requires them to be resident for an appreciable period, so it's not defined. And there are already concerns about this and the potential consequences in the event of a significant return of British people who are currently resident in the EU. So what this tells us is that what's problematic for migrants is not necessarily beneficial for those with the legal status of citizenship. And I think foregrounding some of the assumptions underlying the idea of and the ideal of the worker citizen can help expose this. the idea that a person deserves social support on the basis of their labour. Rights to social assistance are now increasingly distributed not on the basis of citizenship, but on the basis of preparedness to work. Austerity cuts have entailed the rise in pensionable age, tough disability and sickness regulations, and tightening requirements on lone parents. But this is cast as being people who are no longer legitimately inactive, so older people or citizens who are sick or with disabilities. This is cast as being inclusive because it means that people who are disabled have value because they can work. But importantly, being a worker doesn't simply designate participation in certain kinds of activity. Being a worker is also, it's a bit like citizenship, it's also a normative status. It signifies that you are a working kind of person. So citizens who are accessing social benefits must demonstrate that they are a working kind of person by engaging in job-seeking activities and improving their employability through work-related programs. In some jurisdictions, if they fail to comply with these behaviours, they can be subject to sanctions and have their benefits withdrawn. So I find this statistic quite shocking. So in the UK, so basically you have your benefits withdrawn for any period, but it can be for up to 3 years. And it happens immediately. Your benefits just get stopped. And, of course, these are people who don't have spare cash floating around. So if that benefit stopped, you're subject to material hardship. In the UK in 2014, there were 1,030,000 instances where people had their benefits stopped for a period of time. Professor David Webster described the appeal system that you have to go through if you want to get your benefit back or you want to challenge the fact that you've had a sanction imposed. He described it in the following way. He said, this is a, quote, secret penal system because the decisions are made in secret by officials. The claimant is not present, they are not legally represented, the punishment is applied before there is any hearing. If they get a hearing, it is only long after the punishment has been applied. You are talking unmistakably about a penal system which has a set of characteristics which I would suggest are totally unacceptable in a democratic society. So for someone working on immigration, this is kind of eerily familiar territory. This was in evidence that he gave to the select committee, to DWP select committee. So worker is a certain kind of status, and being a worker designates a certain kind of status. So there's certain kinds of work that whose performance does not turn you into a worker. And of course, feminists have been talking about this for a long time in relation to reproductive work. The kind of work that's performed by women in the house. What is included as work and who is included as a worker requires attention to the social relations of work. So, for something to be called work, we must consider not only what is being done, but by whom, for whom, and why. So not all economic activity is work, even if this is your livelihood. So again, you think about the feminist debates about sex work and prostitution, you think about begging, you think about certain types of selling. Those who perform these activities are often not considered to be workers, and their claim to be so is political and contested. Interning, volunteering, prison labour, labour market activation programmes, all these kinds of activities are excluded from employment protections because they're not proper work. The Marshallian view of citizenship as progress to the enjoyment of equal fundamental social rights under a well-provisioned state is a fantasy even for nationals. EU citizenship is further differentiated. To have the right to reside after 3 months, you have to be engaged in what the Commission has called genuine and effective work. That means that you count as a worker. The question then of what constitutes genuine and effective work is decided at a national level. And again, predictably in the UK, it's very harsh. And one of the kind of markers of genuine and effective work is that you earn over £123 a week for 3 months, which actually, if you're in precarious work, the kind that many EU nationals are in, is actually quite a hard thing to do. So you don't count as a worker unless you have managed to do this, as well as jump through various other hoops. Now, the risk for UK nationals, I think, is that should there ever need to be a definition of genuine and effective work, hey, there's already one that we can pull out of the bag, and here it is. We've seen, I think, several instances of where measures that have been used, or whose principle has been allowed because it's directed against migrants, has had negative consequences for UK citizens. I mean, I think Asia cards, the cards that asylum seekers were given, where instead of cash to get certain provisions so that they could get the basic necessities of life, and which basically you had a certain amount and you could only go to a certain store, Tesco's or whatever, to cash this, or not to cash it, to use it. And then now those same cards are being used for emergency payments for people who are in sort of desperate situations with regard to social welfare. So, you know, you allow the principle and then suddenly you find it gets mainstream. So the worker citizen produces 2 forms of undeservingness: idleness, that's the citizen, and not belonging, that's the migrant. And I think thinking about the worker citizen and the ways in which work and its relationship with citizenship shapes the experience of both citizens and migrants can be one way of finding connections and different ways of understanding and thinking about citizenship and what so-called migrants and so-called citizens can share, rather than simply positioning them as rivalries for a certain kind of membership. So I think that we need to think about these kinds of connections and actually kind of in real life, how can we uncover these kinds of connections, which is not actually that hard. They should be staring at us all the time. And I think one of the barriers we have actually with uncovering these connections is precisely the focus on mobility and migration. Because I think that suggests that actually it's migration that's the problem and the solution is we've just got to stop it. But of course, the people who are moving, the problem is the border guard, is not migration per se, and migration actually, you could say, is the solution to many problems of colonial histories and post-colonial presence, and civil war and violence, and systems, economic systems that really render the lives of many people in the world unsustainable and impoverished. So while this is played out at the border, to see this as a problem of migration is impossibly limiting. So our challenge is to draw out the connections between, on the one hand, increasing European poverty and associated popular anger and resentment on the one hand, and what is happening outside of Europe, whatever we mean by that word, on the other. I suspect that the Trump and Brexit victories were in part fueled by an understandable anxiety about the erosion of the privilege of the global north, which is parasitic on the poverty of the global south. If 1 in 3 of the light bulbs in France are fueled by uranium produced in Niger, the world's poorest country and former French colony, these light bulbs are not only glowing in the Champs-Élysées, but also in the homes of the poor, including the migrants themselves. And if the price of electricity goes up, they will be the first to suffer. In 2014, the World Bank calculated that anyone earning €30,000 or above is in the top 1% of global income earners. I am in the top 0.8%. I appreciate that for people who are struggling to survive in a wealthy country, the poverty of most of the world is a properly terrifying prospect. But there are also 83 people who own half the world's assets. This at the moment is reduced to a simple message. We have to look after our own first. We must first attend to the housing and health needs of whatever the British, French, European population, Sorry, there isn't enough to go round. But too often, we only look after our own in the context of immigration, and many of the voices that champion the white working class in this regard are silent when it comes to the many other ways in which those people are marginalised. Challenging this logic that sets up citizens and migrants or foreigners as engaged in an unfortunate but necessary competition for scarce resources really must be of critical concern to those advocating progressive politics. Because the risk is that the obsession engendered by immigration actually only increases exploitation in labour markets, destabilises neighbourly relations and caricatures democratic politics. The fantasy citizenship that is promoted by the bifurcation of the migrant and the citizen is one in which legal citizenship equates to full inclusion, but citizenship as a legal status does not grant full social inclusion. And the state is deeply implicated both in non-citizenship and in differentiations between citizens, as it is in the construction and promulgation of the worker citizen. But fantasy citizenship also benefits from the affective pull of the nation, from which the state derives much of its legitimacy. In an age of precarity, it seems that the nation has an ever stronger affective pull, and worker solidarities are difficult to generate in a gig economy and an era of accelerating inequalities at all scales. But mobility and international migration are indications precisely of our interdependence, and it's interdependence that has the potential to generate solidarity. The challenge is how to make these interdependencies not just readable, but into a good story. And perhaps we can start from the insight that what is bad for migrants is often bad for citizens too.
Thanks very much, Bridget. It's really, really thought-provoking as well as inspiring, drawing out of these connections that it's not only important to make in terms of scholarship and truth-telling, but drawing out the political significance of what happens when we don't make these connections between the conditions in which citizens find themselves are related to the conditions in which we ask people to live their lives as migrants. One thing you said that reminded me, the secret, you were quoting someone, the secret penal system, how the immigration controls then trickle down to municipal controls and generate those conditions. And I thought of the film I, Daniel Blake, which is really, I would be curious to know what you thought about the film in general, but specifically, I think what was its most successful function was to expose that secretive penal system through the life of one man. You don't need to respond to that, you can think about that, and I just wanted to make that comment and then turn immediately to our audience to see if there are any questions.
I'm also interested in France, actually. I mean, and how kind of the idea of who counts as a migrant and the ways in which kind of politically the migrant figures and the welfare and the kind of unemployed person, whether that's different, the same.
I mean, like, I'm a student here at the University of London Institute in Paris, and I can still get housing benefit, even though I'm not a registered citizen. We get something called CAF, which is they give me money literally just for living here. It's more complicated than that. You have to send up a million forms, and you have to prove, like, you have a valid reason for being in the country, be it a student, be it working. But the French system gives out quite easily. That being said, I was recently in hospital, and on my form on the front it said like legal, like immigration status unknown. So which I found quite bizarre, because I was like, I'm an EU citizen, and they still said to me is on the move, like not knowing. So I don't know.
So that was actually on the front of the form.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm coming very late, so I don't know what you said before. What I could say in France, well, in the long term, is that the European citizenship is planned to be more protective, and people will have separate access between European citizenship and local citizenship, national French citizenship. I don't know how you spoke about the European citizenship now in UK. If you spoke about during your speech, this I would be very much in interest. I also have a question. What will happen? You have a free, I would say, circulation between South Ireland and UK, and you have now to start again with Europe and to go out of the European free circulation. But how is it connected between the two? Because if it is only to pass through South Ireland to go inside UK, it's another problem that I would be very much in interest to know how it.
Yeah, well, I think that is a really big question, because I mean, basically now they're talking about, is there going to be a hard border between the north and south of Ireland, which...
Because of that?
Yeah, because of, yeah, exactly. So there's real, in a way I think that one of the things, I mean, if only I was looking at this in, like, I don't know, 200 years in the future and not actually having to kind of live it, but you feel that, you know, the breakup of the United Kingdom, I mean, with Scotland actually seriously agitating for independence, the Northern Ireland and the hard border and what the consequences of that hard border for the peace process, I think it's a real, you know, I do think that there are really serious questions that are now coming onto the table about what the what is this, what is this place, and how are its component parts related to England? You know, what's the difference between how does England play in this kind of arrangement as well? So I'm no expert on it, but I think that I do think that that is going to be politically very hot. Yeah.
Thanks, Bridget. A lot of really interesting ideas. I wanted to pick up on your point about definitions, which I thought was really effective. And I was thinking of one sort of positive outcome of this questioning of expert counting and definitions is that it opens up that these are political, that there's not any one way to count, that, you know, numbering and counting is in and of itself already political and normative because you can count in different ways. So I thought maybe this is a possibility, because it's something a lot of us in the academy have critiqued the numbers as though they're just simple reflections. But then in relation to that, I thought there was a really interesting point coming out also to say that definitions are only one sort of moment in who counts as a migrant or who counts as a citizen. Back to Engin's point about Daniel Blake, we see how there's a definition of who is a worthy beneficiary, but then there's all these processes, forms, procedures, interviews, discretion, whether one can even use a computer terminal that can determine one's access to as a claimant. So I was thinking of all those practices of the migrant who is seeking to come, who goes through similar long-winded procedures with, you know, petty sovereigns, you know, exercising considerable force in terms of how they, you know, determine their life chances and possibilities to those of the benefits person. So I was not so sure, there's a question there, but kind of like the definitions, there's a possibility, but then when I think of the practices, I think how also can those become more politicized, as this film does really well, you know, showing just the poor person falling between the cracks and making a claim.
I'm actually going to see it tomorrow.
I was just about to say it ends with this, but
I know, because I kind of know the story, but I'm going to see it tomorrow in the town hall with the masses. So
wow.
Yeah, so I think this question of the politicization is, I mean, so on the one hand, I think it is something that people now don't trust statistics. But I think the trouble is it then goes along with then, well, you can prove anything you want. You know, it goes along with then just not believing anything or not having just saying, well, I just concede that the Polish person took my job, and that's so.
Right.
But I think the other point is about those bureaucracies and the practice of bureaucracies. That is, I think then you see the immense power actually of the street level bureaucrats and how they really make a difference. You know, they really make a difference to people's lives. And certainly I know when you go to immigration appeal hearings, the first thing you look at is who's the judge, because you will know more or less by who it is. So it's very, and actually interestingly enough, those hearings are not, you can't, they're public documents, but you can't search them on any database. They're not electronically available, so you can't prove prove that, but that was the case. But I think, you know, but also people can be very kind, you know, and I think that's also where you see interesting things happening at the level of the city and versus the level of the national. So you see people who are confronted with actually the human costs of policies, trying to work their ways around it. And the other thing I think you see is the way that citizenship sort of is given a value. So I suppose, so like with the right to rent or the right to work, actually, things that if you get checked, because now checking documents has become so commonplace, what that means is, I think, as a British citizen, is that you feel like, oh, thank goodness I'm a citizen. You know, thank goodness I'm going to be okay because I don't. So there's that, in a way, that gives a value to the citizenship that you weren't aware of before, but has become made very visible. So I think I agree. I think these kind of bureaucratic practices are actually incredibly important. And I think also that old kind of sociological question about emotion and reason and how that plays in bureaucracies is also very kind of live with immigration questions.
I found it a really fascinating discussion, and one of the things that I'm not an academic, I'm here for personal interest. Originally Canadian and recently in France. So I'm always curious when I hear about the effort it takes for people to leave. And you talked about the effort it takes for people to leave wherever they're, migrating from. I mean, that's not an easy thing for anybody to do. And so I'm actually a nurse by training, and so I always wonder, when you talked today about interdependence between nations and what it would mean to have nations working more effectively so that migration could be a less painful procedure, process, what would it take so that people wouldn't have to leave? And what is the threshold? At what point do people feel so stressed by their environment that they will muster the energy and resources to leave, even if they don't know what they're heading towards? So your discussion was interesting, that it focused a lot on the recipient nations and their responsibilities. But what about the nations where the people are fleeing from? How can nations work in an interdisciplinary fashion so that when there is that pressure that people feel to leave, how can that be addressed?
I think that's a really complicated question. There's so much in there. So I suppose one thing that I would say is that, firstly, that it's often not the poorest people who leave. I mean, that's the kind of standard thing that migration scholars sort of always roll out, but it's true, because you have to have some, generally you need some kind of resources to leave. I think that we also have to recognise that people are kind of poor and get blown up because that's not independent of our own security in wealthy countries, and both economic and political. And also that actually also people sometimes move, that there's nothing, necessarily normal or abnormal about staying and moving. Some people can just move because they want to move, you know, they just have the spirit of adventure, and it's also, when does that, and it's interesting to think about the scales of the movement. So moving from your village to the town, for example, can be a traumatic move. But actually we tend to just focus on mobility across borders and not make the connections with those different scales of mobility. So I think in a way there's a sort of whole kind of rich, it's not, people move for all kinds of different reasons, and it's not necessarily, you know, negative, not necessarily because they're having a bad time, but because actually, you know, they fancy spending some time in Australia. They're young kids, you know, they want to go and, I don't know, be in Canada or whatever. Just whereas for other people, moving can be deeply traumatic. So perhaps one of the challenges is precisely by labelling everything migration, we then miss out on all of these distinctions. Yeah. So that's the beginning of a conversation, I suppose.
Well, I guess what I was hearing is that your focus was mainly on the disadvantaged who migrate, people who migrate not necessarily, I mean, mostly for economic reasons, maybe, or due to physical insecurity. So I was curious as to how those vulnerable people would be maybe less vulnerable. I mean, are there scales of vulnerability? Because sometimes people migrate because they think, wow, we're going to get out of whatever situation we're in, and they wind up, you know, leaving Mexico and going to the United States, for example, it might not be any better. So it might be that they're entering circumstances that they find very difficult and they want to return, where people think that there's a fantasy of whatever. You know, either they're not getting resources, or they don't find the employment, or the conditions are not quite what they thought. So how can people get access to the information that they would need to make the best decisions for themselves? And if there's so much, I mean, on mass scales, if there's, let's say, some disaster or what have you, or there's just panic sets in, that's really difficult to address.
Louise?
Thanks so much. That's really interesting, and I suppose this is going to be a general question, but I want to frame it around a remark about the vocabulary in France, because I think it's important as well, and just because, and you were asking yourself, you were interested in placing that. So I think the vocabulary in France is one about the papier, the papers, because one of the big differences, and that relates to your situation at hospital, is the requirement to have an identity card on you the whole time. So if you're an undocumented minor, you're a sans-papier, and there was, in 1996, was the big moment of the sans-papier movement in France, which kind of preceded, therefore, has kind of like 20-year sort of, you know, overhang on the contemporary situation of migration today. And you've got the, you know, and it was a very politicized moment with and it was a largely West African long-term resident population that constituted itself as a collectif des sans-papiers. And the big question for them was whether or not they wanted regularization or not. Been in France for a long time, fully paid up members of society, paying, you know, taxation, social security charges, having children, and yet remaining sans-papier out of choice. You know, so that's out of choice, out of that hadn't yet been a political revendication. So that question then sort of, you know, at that context as a frame to what I'm understanding, if I generalize the position you're taking around this need to think citizenship as opposed to think migrants, and I totally buy what you're saying, that actually think migrant, we're thinking in terms of definitions and distinctions, as thinking citizenships, we're thinking potentially umbrellas. But we're also thinking in that context in a frame of rights. And if what I'm understanding you to be saying is, you know, let's be careful. If we think everything in terms of rights, well then they might change the ways in which you qualify for those rights, you know. So actually that might start concerning us as well as them, and therefore it's dangerous. So I suppose that's my question mainly is, you know, are we not, by turning the focus towards citizenship, not actually still rolling over a discourse of rights? And don't we need to actually just really sort of like bite the bullet and say, okay, what are we doing with this discourse of rights all the time? And I think that's where I find it really interesting. Again, it's my experience very much, mirrors what you're describing about what happens in local concrete situations where there's a framework and then there's a series of negotiations, and then there's a series of factors which we can't map onto a discourse of rights. And we have to start having an academic mode for thinking about what that give is in and how we conceptualize what's happening in those situations without thinking that actually we've got better ways of being equivalent to a right.
Yeah, no, I agree, actually. I agree, and I think I'm pleased that you say that, because that is where I would like to go. That is where I would like to go, is actually then to stretch this conversation about citizenship, to say, well, but is this really adequate for what we want? Are we asking for enough? It seems like, actually maybe the problem doesn't mean we're asking for too much. Maybe the problem is we're not asking for enough. We need to be asking for more than what we've got. Then the question is, well, but what are you asking for? And then that's when I think, well, now we've really got to start. I don't know, but I want to start imagining what that and living what that could be. And it's almost like, I think it's not about having a kind of idea, it's about working it out in praxis and thinking with that praxis and not quite sure where it's going. But that it needs to be, I think, both embedded in the local but also international, but also but also thinking of situating ourselves within this kind of immensely unequal world that we live in. That's so, yeah.
The reason for framing it, I forgot kind of a little bit, around the sans-papier things, there's a really interesting project at the time, a little bit later than the main sans-papier mobilization, which was Vas-y, monte ta carte, which was this kind of like major public thing of just saying, in terms of yours thing, we feel now if we've got a British passport, we go to take the Eurostar and we're like, okay, no worries, no stress, unless we might happen to be going through with children who don't have the same name. We encounter at the same time, all the time, the questioning. I think that actually, that's a very directly and commonly lived experience that these are very fragile rights, even with a British passport. And but nonetheless, so that project at the time, Vas-y, monte ta carte, was just like, look, fess up, show the one you've got, and show it with somebody else. And so it was a really interesting kind of like dynamic of putting the space of the identity card attached to an individual with a photo in the space of another person without, and then asking, well, who does this belong to, sort of thing, whose card is this type thing, and the way the photos worked in public space really blurred that boundary, and it's one of the most powerful things I've seen that nailed that question very directly.
That's really interesting. I remember I went to a conference in Austria, which was called, I don't speak German, but it was called Unterdocumented. So it was about undocumented people, but they were called underdocumented people. And then when I was talking to to the Austrians, and they were telling me about their requirements, that basically if you move house, you have to inform the government sort of like in the week, or else you're in trouble, blah, blah, blah. I was like, wow, the problem is you're over-documented. That's really what, not they're under-documented. So I think the question, it'll be interesting to see where ID cards go in Britain. I sort of think they will come in, really. But I think that questions of ID documents and how those play, I think in different countries in Europe is really fascinating.
Any other questions?
I got another.
As
well. I wanted to come back to your point on differentiated migration, and to this person's question earlier about why people move. It's quite fascinating how bankers who move from London to Luxembourg to Geneva and take their families and move about frequently are not an object of concern, or academics, 30% of UK academics are from outside the UK and mostly EU. And that was an issue raised with Philip Hammond. 30%. 30% are not holding UK passports and mostly EU, so-called migrants, and many not having permanent leave to remain either. And at a question and answer period with Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, where an academic said, well, you know, what are you going to do about this? Not only about the rights of existing people who have come from other countries in the EU, but future flow, because we have major flows between universities. How are we going to address that? And his answer was, well, no, we don't have to worry, because that's the kind of migration we want.
Yeah.
It's the other kind, and he used that word, it's the other kind. That's the problem. Don't you worry, academics or bankers or, you know, that's okay. That's good migration, because it's, you know, it's about you taking your capital, cultural capital, and going elsewhere, and also accepting people with capital, and that kind of capital we recognize. And I think that kind of differentiation, you know, that's not problematic.
But yeah, the way that that's brought into as well. So, for example, a few years ago, there was this thing that went around the university, Oxford University, about illegal seminar speakers, right? So there's this problem, which is that people coming, you know, they're flying into Heathrow to, I don't know, their son's getting married or something, and then their mate in Oxford says, why don't you come and give a talk? And then you go and you give a talk, but you don't actually have any kind of visa. Now they've got a visa for that. But at the time you didn't have a visa, you know. And actually I experience this quite a lot when I'm travelling and they say, you're working, and I'm kind of like, well, I'm going for a conference, is that work? Well, not really, but you know, which one do I tick? So anyway, so Oxford decided a big problem with illegal seminar speakers. So it sent around this note to everyone saying, illegal seminar speakers will be escorted from the premises by university security, and you know, you have to make sure that you've all got the right visas. So there was like an uproar, because, you know, it was like, well, but this, you know, this is about academic freedom. This shouldn't be allowed. This is disgusting. You know, it was like, well, and you have to then have, I don't know, £22,000 if they're a child. So basically, and something like 2/3 of women in work in Britain don't earn enough to bring in a spouse. So I mean, that's an example of where there's massive discrimination. You know, and of course, if you're unemployed, you can't do it.
You can't.
And I mean, that's true, but that kind of requirement is not peculiar to the UK. It's very common in, I think, I hesitate to say all, but it might be all EU states.
It's much higher in the UK. The requirement in the UK is higher.
Yeah. But still, you can't be unemployed. I mean, if you're unemployed, it's very difficult to bring in a spouse or a partner.
When you are foreign, but when you are UK nationals, the situation is the same, and you have to bring a spouse, foreign spouse.
If you're an EU national, you don't have to have that requirement. So that's the bizarre way around it.
But if you are UK national, you have to.
Yeah. So if you're an EU national who's residing in the UK, then
it's more easy.
It's easy.
It's always more protective. Yeah. And this, you think it will go? It will go on after the Brexit also, or
no,
it will be stopped?
I'm sure that will be stopped. Yeah, I'm sure that will be stopped.
On that note, perhaps, unless there's another burning question, I think we have tired Bridget. But I would like to sincerely thank Bridget not only for giving a splendid lecture, but also for all the work she does in bringing immense clarity to issues of immigration and migration and citizenship. As she also argued, these are very hotly contested, sensitive subjects for the ways in which they have been constituted, and it becomes more and more difficult to have actually clarity to think about what options we have, what connections we can draw, what connections we can make between various things happening in our lives and the lives of others, or lives of people who have been constituted as our others. So this has been really a real delight. Thanks very much for joining me. Thank you. And thanks very much for coming and being part of this event as well. See you next time.